If you've spent just about any time online and you're anyone other than a cis white guy, the following situation will probably sound pretty familiar. A random man you've never heard of pops out of nowhere to talk to you.
Guess I dialed the wrong number.
Maybe he replied to an innocuous tweet or slid right into your DMs. You may ignore him, but he keeps coming back.
Don't hang up.
What?
I want to talk to you for a second.
They've got 900 numbers for that. See ya.
The talking quickly turns to unprompted, unwelcome flirting.
So, you got a boyfriend?
Why? You want to ask me out on a date?
Or quizzing you on your interests, often with the assumption that he knows more than you.
You like scary movies?
Uh-huh.
What's your favorite scary movie?
Oh, you like punk? What's your favorite punk band then? Have you even heard of Dead Kennedys? When you get sick of it and turn him down, he gets aggressive.
Listen, asshole!
No, you listen, you little bitch. You hang up on me again, I'll gut you like a fish, understand?
The barely veiled anger, entitlement, and resentment behind those earlier interactions are now completely in the open, epithets and death threats frequently made in public view. This type of interaction is frighteningly common, especially online, and it also describes the opening of Scream, the 1996 horror film that turned the genre around by similarly taking what was implicit, the rules and subtext of the slasher subgenre, and making it explicit, working it into the text itself. It's a meta-commentary on the genre and, I would argue, on the elements of toxic masculinity and misogyny that appear in so many slashers before it, elements that loomed large in the public consciousness in the mid-90s. For the purposes of this essay, I'll mainly be focusing on the effects of toxic masculinity on cis men and their actions towards an impact on women. This is due to the composition of Scream's cast, which is made up of all white and presumably cis men and women. The effects of toxic masculinity stretch far beyond this narrow group, affecting every gender identity, not just cis men and women, they just aren't represented in Scream. Scream takes most of its cues from the slasher subgenre, as well as from the giallo tradition that preceded it. These giallo films were popularized in the late 60s and 70s by Italian directors like Lucio Fulci, Dario Argento, Mario Bava, and others. They took elements from thrillers, psychological dramas, detective stories, horror movies, and other pulp genres and mixed them together, introducing heightened violence, mystery killers, eroticism, and dense atmosphere. These films, along with works like Psycho and Peeping Tom, influenced the American slasher movie, a horror subgenre that features a lot of murder, usually done with a bladed weapon like a knife or machete, hence the name slasher. Early slashers include films like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, John Carpenter's seminal Halloween, Friday the 13th, and so on. The structures of these films quickly fell into a familiar pattern. As Carol J. Clover describes succinctly in Her Body, Himself, Gender in the Slasher Film is the immensely generative story of a psycho killer who slashes to death a string of mostly female victims, one by one, until he himself is subdued or killed, usually by the one girl who has survived. While many slashers were critically derided upon their releases for their thin plots and gratuitous violence, they amassed a large cult following and made plenty of money at the box office. Given the loose story structure and common plot elements, the formula was pretty easy to replicate.
There's a formula to it, a very simple formula!
Leading to tons of sequels and imitators throughout the 70s and 80s.
Cause let's face it, baby, these days, you gotta have a sequel!
By the beginning of the 90s, audiences seemed to have had enough. Box office numbers for slasher movies were down, and some of the major franchises were sold off to other companies. Wes Craven's New Nightmare, a sequel to the long-running Nightmare on Elm Street series, was released in 1994, updating the formula of the slasher. It was self-referential and ironic throughout, reflecting the attitudes of mid-90s viewers who were weary of the genre and looking for something a little more postmodern and contemporary. Scream took all of these elements from New Nightmare and cranked them up even more, including characters fully aware of the tropes of slasher movies and more self-referential humor. Scream was a huge success, had multiple sequels, and helped redefine horror for years. If you want a deeper dive into Scream in relation to the genre and the director Wes Craven, check out Movies with Mikey's great video on the subject. Part of what made Scream such a success was taking the tropes of the genre and acknowledging them within the film, essentially telling the audience, yeah, I get it, you've seen these movies before, well, so have the characters, they're like you. Many of the tenets of the genre called out by the movie are still there. There's a masked killer, lots of blood, teenagers in peril, but some of the themes are inverted. Drew Barrymore is introduced in the opening of the film, the apparent protagonist and final girl, only to be summarily killed off before the opening credits. The movie also spells out the unofficial rules of the slasher that much of the audience had by then long been wise to.
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. Number 1. You can never have sex.
Why are you boring me? I'm right.
Number 2, you can never drink or do drugs. And number 3, never, ever, ever, under any circumstances say, I'll be right back.
These rules of horror are at their base subtextual reflections of societal views on womanhood and what women should not be allowed to do lest they be punished. Scream takes this subtext of the genre and makes it text within the film, spelling it out clearly and, in doing so, points out some of the inherent problems with slashers and seeks to rectify some of them. Slasher films have a complicated history when it comes to gender. Although many slashers feature women protagonists who go through hell but survive, dubbed the final girl, they also commonly torture these women emotionally, physically, or both. They also heavily engage in what Laura Mulvey coined the male gaze in her essay Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. Women in film are often subjected to long, panning shots over their body that pause the forward momentum of the story, or are stripped down to levels that men are not, and as Mulvey notes, the woman displayed has functioned on 2 levels, as erotic object for the characters within the screen story, and as erotic object for the spectator within the auditorium, meaning that films use the form of the medium, such as camera movements, slow-motion pans, displays of nudity, not only to indulge in the desires of the characters, but also of the presumed viewer. This is especially heightened in the slasher genre. The camera sometimes takes a literal first-person perspective, that of the killer. Halloween's opening and Friday the 13th both use this trick, locking the audience into the killer's gaze as they stalk their victims, who, as Clover noted, are largely women. This creates a sort of tense bond between viewer and killer, placing the viewer in a liminal space where the voyeuristic pleasure of viewing pushes up against our concerns for the lives of the victims we are viewing. Slashers are also known to have frequent or prolonged sequences of nudity and brutal violence, again largely but not exclusively featuring young women. Clover argues that these artistic choices, that is, the qualities that locate the slasher film outside the usual aesthetic system, are the very qualities that make it such a transparent source for subcultural attitudes towards sex and gender in particular. Without the complicated plots or production afforded many other films, slashers more directly mirror social anxieties and attitudes, specifically those surrounding gender given the common split between the identities of the killers, mostly men, and the protagonists, usually women. Women are treated as disposable, other than the final girl. They are to be leered at and killed if they step out of line. Scream recognizes the misogyny and patriarchal tendencies present in slasher movies and offers up a critique. The killers in Scream are explicitly misogynistic men, well-versed in horror entertainment and embracing different forms of toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity is a concept derived from the notion of hegemonic masculinity, that is, defined by R.W. Connell and James W. Messerschmitt in their article, Hegemonic Masculinity: Rethinking the Concept for Gender and Society. Hegemonic masculinity was understood as the pattern of practice, i.e. things done, not just a set of role expectations or an identity, that allowed men's dominance over women to continue. These things done can vary depending on the culture, time period, and various other factors, but what they share is the outcome, men asserting control over others. This doesn't mean that all things that men do are toxic, as Terry A. Cuppers clarifies in Toxic Masculinity as Barrier to Mental Health Treatment in Prison. There is nothing especially toxic in a man's pride in his ability to win at sports, to maintain solidarity with a friend, to succeed at work, or to provide for his family, as long as they aren't done in excess or at the expense of others. Connell and Messerschmitt also point out that not every man has to embody these ideas for them to be powerful, saying that hegemonic masculinities can be constructed that don't correspond closely to the lives of any actual men. Yet these models do, in various ways, express widespread ideals, fantasies, and desires, and so too can these fantasies and desires be reflected in our media. Kuppers enumerates several practices and behaviors that demonstrate this idea, saying, today's hegemonic masculinity in the United States of America and Europe includes a high degree of ruthless competition and inability to express emotions other than anger, an unwillingness to admit weakness or dependency, devaluation of women and all feminine attributes in men, homophobia, and so forth. Jacqueline Friedman furthers this point in Toxic Masculinity for the American Prospect, arguing that these practices leave men stoic sex and violence machines with allergies to tenderness, playfulness, and vulnerability. Toxic masculinity acts as a sort of mask that men can wear to uphold hierarchies and to police behaviors both within groups of men and in those outside of their groups, like women and non-binary people. This is a lot of technical language to say that, essentially, these are things that men do to prove they're real men, to enforce traditional gender roles and assert control over others. Based on these sources, a list of unofficial rules for being a man can be constructed then, much like Scream's rules for staying alive in horror movies. 1. Sex, emphasis on sexual conquest and domination. 2. Stoicism, repression of all emotions other than anger. 3. Violence. Strength and brutality matter most. 4. Misogyny and femphobia, hatred or devaluation of all things not traditionally masculine. Unlike other slashers that frequently have faceless villains with little discernible motivation, Scream uses its killers in the story, spoilers, Billy and Stu, as stand-ins for this constellation of toxic traits and practices. By making the killers explicitly support these ideas, Scream critiques some of the inherent problems with the genre and comments on the state of masculinity in the United States. Billy takes the role of the ostensible leader of the two killers. That there are two killers at all is relevant and will come back into play later. He exhibits many of these outlined toxic practices and beliefs, one of which is the drive for men to have sex by nearly any means. Early on in the film, Billy surprises Sydney, the protagonist of the film and Billy's girlfriend, by climbing through her bedroom window while her dad is home. He then goes on to pressure her into moving the relationship forward, which is to say, into having sex, even though she indicates she isn't ready.
Well, 2 years ago, we started off hot and heavy. And now, things have changed, and lately we're just sort of edited for television.
He again tries to convince her further into the movie, this time leaning on her mother's death and its related trauma to make her feel bad about not being ready.
You haven't been the same since your mother died.
He tells her to just get over it, indicating that he's gotten over his father leaving, which is not at all true.
I think it's time you got over that. I mean, when my mom left my dad, I accepted it. It's the way it is.
Sydney responds,
I am sorry if my traumatized life is an inconvenience to you and your perfect existence.
She later admits that she's afraid she'll end up like her mother.
I think I'm really scared that I'm gonna turn out just like her, you know?
Who was derided for her open sexuality and even eventually murdered for it.
Why did you kill my mother?
We did your mom a favor, Sid. That woman was a slutbag whore who flashed her shit all over town like she was Sharon Stone or something.
Yeah, we put her out of her misery, because let's face it, Sydney, your mother was no Sharon Stone.
Billy and other men like him can use this societal pressure often put on women to coax them into doing what they want and then chastise them for doing that very thing. This double bind ensures that they'll be ridiculed, considered lesser whether they have sex or not. This also ties into the horror trope, the first unofficial rule, don't have sex, which often means brutal punishment for women in slashers who engage in anything that goes against hegemonic masculinity's ideal woman.
Sex equals death, okay?
In the climax of the film, Billy outright says that this is the reason he killed Sydney's mother, and why he plans to kill Sydney as well.
Now you're no longer a virgin. That virgin. Now you gotta die. Those are the rules.
Sydney does have sex near the end of the film though, but she isn't shown naked, which would probably have happened in another slasher, and isn't punished for it, even though the movie foreshadows that, like many other movies, sex equals death. This works as a critique of the sexual double standards in horror movies and as a rebuke of Billy's toxic pursuit of sex. These gendered norms around sex aren't only policed by men, however. Social norms affect everyone, and women can internalize some of these ideologies too. When Sid is hiding in the bathroom at school, she overhears two of her classmates talking about her.
She was never attacked. I think she made it all up.
How did she lie about it?
For attention. The girl has some serious issues.
This idea that someone would make up an assault for attention, that you shouldn't believe the victim, can be seen in the real world nearly any time that someone comes forward with stories of abuse, assault, harassment, etc. Ghostface doesn't speak when he's physically around his victims, and his mask is twisted into a gaunt facade that can't express any emotions at all. As one of the killers behind the mask, Billy's lack of emotion throughout the film is a classic behavior associated with toxic masculinity. Emotions are seen as feminine or weak, and are not to be felt or at least not expressed. The exception to that is anger, which Billy does show both in phone calls to his victims
If you hang up on me, you'll die just like your mother.
and in his motives for killing. The only time Billy seems to feel anything is when he's tormenting women, like he does to Sid in the final scenes of the movie, reveling in the violence he's caused. Stu uses humor to avoid any emotional vulnerability. Not only that, his humor is used to bully others and goad them into conforming. As Jessica Draskett and others note in Old Jokes, New Media, Online Sexism and Constructions of Gender in Internet Memes, two types of humor can be employed in relation to social norms. Disciplinary humor works to mock those who are outside of social norms, like when Stu belittles Steve's lack of assertiveness and his horror fanboy nature, whilst conversely, rebellious humor mocks and subverts established rules and conventions. Much of Stu's humor is of the second category, the rebellious, callous, gross-out humor of a typical teenage boy. What is it rebelling against, though, and in service to what? Stu's humor serves to undermine typical emotional responses as he mocks the disgust his friends feel about the gutting of murder victims.
Never alone. Ow, liver. It was a joke.
While this may technically be rebellious, it's also repressive and normalizes violence and the lack of emotion that are both core to toxic masculinity. Draskett et al. Caution, even humor that at first appears rebellious may in fact serve to reinforce dominant social norms. For example, those who tell racist or sexist jokes may frame themselves as rebelling against political correctness. This can be seen in memes and jokes online and Netflix specials that reinforce reactionary beliefs. Humor can ridicule and police certain behaviors and is adept at subtly influencing people to accept or at least legitimize vile ideologies by smuggling them through jokes. Memes are a powerful recruitment tool for hegemonic systems looking to co-opt the anger of young men struggling to live up to these toxic expectations that are put on them. I won't be showing much of the violence here, but this category should be evident if you've seen the movie, so it shouldn't be too long. The killings in Scream are brutal and intimate, combining bare hands and short knives. Billy and Stu also commit other forms of violence by harassing, stalking, belittling, and tormenting their victims and those around them. They even use violence as a friendship exercise in the climactic kitchen scene where the two of them lean in close together and enjoy the horrific brutality they impose on Sydney.
It was fun.
This is unfortunately common in the real world as well, where violence and misogyny can bring toxic men like them together and give them something in common to grow closer over, bonding over the trauma and damage they've caused the women around them. This sort of bonding can also be seen when the men at Stu's party gather around the TV to watch a horror movie together. Most of the women leave the room, and the remaining men are enthralled by the murder and sex on the screen, Stu yelling,
I want to see breasts. I want to see Jamie Lee's breasts. When do we see Jamie Lee's breasts?
and another mentioning the upcoming
Obligatory tit shot.
This space becomes a performative zone for masculinity. Here, they can prove they're real men by communally enjoying and joking about sex and violence together. Stu claims his stake in being a real man by loudly asserting his straightness, his interest in sex, even though he never appears to have sex in the movie, even at the discomfort of the women in the room. It's a power play of sorts, a reiteration of his dominance over women nearby and an interpellation to the other men, a call to engage with his ideology. It's a bit like catcalling. They laugh and joke together, creating friendships around the violence on film, a sort of diegetic reflection and critique of the viewers enjoying the violence in slashers like Scream. Scream engages with the misogyny of the genre throughout its runtime, from critiquing the rules of horror that heavily target women to portraying the violent damage that toxic masculinity can cause in the form of the killers. Although it was released in 1996, Scream also engages with the ways that these toxic practices have evolved with changing technology. The proliferation of communication technologies, cell phones in the film,
What are you doing with a cellular telephone, son?
Everybody's got one, Sheriff.
and social media today facilitate new ways of harassing women, non-binary folks, and non-conforming men. Sydney, like many people online, is stalked and harassed relentlessly, which is mediated through an everyday object, a phone. The real what if phones, but too much. In her article, #self-valence, horrors, slut-shaming through social media, Sir, and self-valence, Hannah Bonner similarly notes the connection between social media harassment and horror tropes. Social media misuse is the new virtual house of horrors. We might consider internet shaming as the afterlife of our horror education, when someone suffers punishment for eliciting an illicit look, who bears her body, or who delights in her hedonistic, i.e. healthy, sexuality. Not only does technology make it easier to find and harass people, it also changes the nature and degree of the harassment. In Gender Trolling, Misogyny Adapts to New Media, Carla Mantia argues that online communities and anonymity have fostered these new forms, and she catalogs the ways that online misogyny manifest as follows: the participation, often coordinated, of numerous people, gender-based insults, vicious language, credible threats, unusual intensity, scope, and longevity of attacks, and reaction to women speaking out. Many of these can be seen in Scream. For instance, the vicious and gender-based language Billy uses against his victims.
You listen, you little bitch. You hang up on me again, I'll gut you like a fish, understand?
The obvious and very credible threats to their lives, the intergenerational nature of the attacks that span at least a year, and the violent anger of the killers when either are confronted.
It's called Guess How I'm Gonna Die! Fuck you!
The relative anonymity afforded by online spaces also factors into Scream's plot. While the killers are masked, the masks are commonly available.
They sell this costume every 5 and dime in the state.
Funnily enough, the costume is called Father Death, meaning that the culprits could be anyone or everyone. Other boys at Sydney's school even wear the mask in one scene and run through the hallway screaming. When they're caught doing something harmful like this, they claim it's just a joke, just like so many online antagonists.
Come on, Mr. Hembry. It was just a joke.
That's not fair!
Though this is supposedly some rebellious joke, the effect of the joke is the same as the effect of Stu's humor, an enforcement of their dominance in the masculine system and the devaluation of Sydney's feelings and anxieties. Other men at different times also handle or wear the mask, even those ostensibly seeking to do good, which diegetically plays with the character's suspicions and misleads them, and by extension the audience, as to who the killer is. But metatextually, it comments on the nature of anonymous networked violence and misogyny. #not all men, but possibly any man. Even men not engaging in this toxic masculinity still have to interact with it, think about it, and deal with the pressures it imposes on men. One of the ways that the killer in Scream is able to get away with the killings is that they are networked in a way. There are actually 2 killers, and they serve as alibis for each other. When Sid suspects Billy, Stu can jump out in full costume to confirm that Billy isn't the killer and vice versa. Like Billy and Stu, abusers in real life often rely on networks of friends whom they've convinced they're one of the good ones, or else on others, usually men, who share in or benefit from their abusive behavior. Sometimes these toxic men aren't called out simply because it isn't a concern for other men in their friend groups. They don't value women's feelings enough to take them seriously. Put simply, abusive men cover for other abusive men. This is even further amplified by social networks. Hundreds of people can pile on one victim and send hundreds or thousands of threats. Bad actors can spread people's information on multiple sites to thousands of viewers, and ideological or hate-driven groups can congregate on places like certain subreddits and discords to plan and share tactics, post heinous jokes, encourage toxic actions, and police each other's behaviors. Even though the killers in Scream are anonymous, they're decidedly human, much like these groups of toxic men. The killers wear masks and stalk victims, but unlike, say, Michael Myers, the killers are wearing unmodified, cheap Halloween costumes sold everywhere. They are also frequently tripped, hit, and knocked over, and they grunt or otherwise make noises when hurt. Unlike the typical slasher villain. This drives home that Sidney isn't tormented by some nightmarish, inhuman monster completely separate from reality, but average men in all of their horrifying normality. As Nicola Railing notes in Every Man and No Man, White Heterosexual Masculinity in Contemporary Serial Killer Movies for Jump Cut, there is an implicit link between the apparent normality of the serial killer and the invisibility afforded by white masculinity. They are able to cause violence undetected because of their seeming normality, their ability to blend in with the social roles ascribed to men, specifically white men. They are seen as the social standard, not a deviation. Among the changes brought about by online culture are changes in what is considered masculine. Nerd culture, once niche and derided by the mainstream, had begun to flourish in the late 90s and 2000s, bringing in huge numbers of new people who enjoyed pieces of nerdy pop culture entertainment, including comic books, alternative comedy, and yes, horror movies. This influx of new fans, though, prompted a backlash, one rooted in toxic masculinity. The backlash is usually specifically rooted in the devaluing of women and gatekeeping them from the fandom. No girls allowed. Billy is well versed in horror tropes.
Corn syrup. Same stuff they use for pig's blood in Carrie.
As are most of the characters, and seems to relish quizzing women on their horror knowledge and punishing them fatally if they don't adhere to his standards.
Name the killer in Friday the 13th.
Jason! Jason! Jason!
He even gets an almost literal well actually moment.
Then you should know Jason's mother, Mrs. Voorhees, was the original killer. Jason didn't show up until the sequel. I'm afraid that was a wrong answer.
This shift is significant. You would never see Jason Voorhees spouting off movie trivia while killing his victims, and it's representative of the virulent misogyny and gatekeeping currently flooding social media, especially on sites like Reddit and Twitter. Billy's absolutely an angry Redditor. Stu is more of a shitposter, which poses its own problems. When Billy, Stu, and the others are together after they're questioned by the police about the first murders, they mention that the officers asked them if any of them like to hunt.
Hey, they asked if you like to hunt? Yeah, they did.
The narrative explains this by saying that the victims were expertly gutted, but also, as Stu, one of the killers, remember, says,
Yeah, Casey and Steve were completely hollowed out. And the fact is, it takes a man to do something like that.
Or a man's mentality.
It's interesting that the police ask about hunting since it's such a traditionally masculine thing, and that Stu is proud of the brutality that he and other men are capable of. In another scene, Sid tries to call the police with her computer in. Was that a thing? That's wild. Scream also takes into consideration the inherited nature of trauma and toxicity. Sydney is stalked and attacked in the same way her mother was, although by different means.
Do you want to die, Sydney? Your mother sure didn't.
The misogyny and violence done to her mother doesn't just disappear, it's carried by the survivors and perpetuated by the systems that allowed it to happen in the first place. This is seen in the largely inept police force accidentally reintroducing the symbol of Sydney's trauma, the mask, to her outside her doorway, and in the news sensationalizing the violence and covering it non-stop. Similarly, toxic practices and beliefs don't spring out of nowhere. They're taught to us by other men, by fathers, brothers, coaches, teachers, to kids and teens, and unless they learn to break free of them, will do the same. Sydney is threatened by avatars of a system of damaging values that seeks to replicate itself. Not only does toxic masculinity function as a mask that men wear to dominate others, the mask wears them as well. It uses them as vehicles for larger social violence and oppression at the cost of their own health. Paul J. Fleming et al. In Real Men Don't, Constructions of Masculinity and Inadvertent Harm in Public Health Interventions show that research indicates men who adhere to the norms of hegemonic masculinity have worse mental health and general well-being than do other men. They're more likely to maintain high degrees of control over their female partners, engage in more sexual risk-taking, avoid healthcare clinics, and enact more physical and sexual violence with their partners as well. Not only is it physically damaging, it also limits the men engaging in it. Hypermasculinity is a limiting narrative. They're not allowed to express themselves, to feel or do anything outside of the narrow confines of what that society considers masculine. Dewey's apparent sensitivity and boyish features prevent him from being taken seriously by his fellow officers and earn him his goofy nickname, Dewey.
Because of my boyish good looks, muscle mass has increased my acceptance as a serious police officer.
Police forces themselves are usually a major boys' club and are rife with toxic masculinity and abuse, but this video is already long enough without going into that. Stu is also affected by this limiting narrative as he is symbolically killed by the system he sought to uphold. Although he uses humor to constantly mask his emotions, this fades away when he and Billy try to frame Sid's father for the murders near the end of the movie. The two killers have to stab each other to make themselves look like victims, not killers. But when they do, Billy gets mad that Stu stabbed him so hard.
God damn it, Stu! Sorry, Billy. I guess I got a little too zealous, huh?
They start a game of pain, a testing of limits and of revenge, a kind of one-upmanship that's pretty common in groups of men, usually sans knife, that seeks to determine who is the toughest. Many games that proliferate among teenage boys follow this logic. Arm punching, bloody knuckles, so-called ball tagging, and even the relatively benign arm wrestling all fit into this category. In this case, Stu gets stabbed too deep.
Stop it, Billy, would you, alright? I can't take any more. I'm feeling a little woozy here.
And starts bleeding out. As he's dying, Sydney asks Stu why he's doing all of this. He responds,
Peer pressure. I'm far too sensitive.
or pressure to conform to a masculine ideal represented by Billy. He says he's too sensitive, implying that he would otherwise be locked out of structures of power, so he accesses them by following the unofficial rules of toxic masculinity. These rules limit his expression, hurt those around him, and eventually kill him.
My mom and dad are gonna be so mad.
Rules like this are meant to be broken, however. Finding yourself engaging in some of these harmful practices doesn't necessarily mean you're bad or toxic forever and can't do better. There are definitely bad actors out there just looking to cause damage, but I don't think they're the majority. Toxic masculinity is also not inherent in men. It's taught to us and imposed on us mainly by other men and by systems run by men. What is masculine can change as times change. What was once the purview of outsiders is now manly and vice versa. Many online communities have made edgy memes and gatekeeping of pop culture now masculine, alongside the harassment of women, non-binary people, and men who don't fit this stereotype. Alternative ideas of what it is to be a man can be found too online, easier than ever, and we can change the ways that our society thinks about men and masculinity. Resources for mental health, therapy, anger management, addiction treatment, de-radicalization, and community building are usually available, but it can often be hard for men to use these services even if they're lucky enough to be able to afford them. Internalization of these rules and limits contribute to it, but so does the social stigma around men seeking help. Usually, and say it with me here, this stigma is enforced by other men. None of this means we should be lenient on these toxic practices or embrace those who knowingly engage in them and just hope they'll someday change on their own. They probably won't. It doesn't mean we shy away from holding men to higher standards. We definitely, desperately need to hold them to higher standards. The standards couldn't really get any lower for white men. It does mean encouraging growth, openness, and vulnerability in each other. It means recognizing these behaviors and thought patterns in yourself and in the men around you, calling them out when they pop up, and working to fix them. It also means correcting or outright dismantling many of the systems that propagate or allow these narratives. Our judicial systems are not currently willing or seemingly able to deal with assault and harassment cases, let alone online harassment. The culture around law enforcement encourages domination, and a large number of cops are also domestic abusers. America's form of patriotism is almost entirely built around inflicting violence on others and asserting our control over them, or dying in the process of doing so. And finally, the kind of intense competition needed to succeed in a capitalist system and the lack of empathy and solidarity that demands are directly tied into harmful masculine ideology. Capitalist rhetoric mirrors many of the same behaviors outlined in this essay, and they play into each other and strengthen one another. Accepting this system as is usually involves putting on the mask in one way or another, whether that's by stifling your empathy for the homeless or embracing the domination that competitive markets incentivize. Anyone attempting to replace or reform capitalism without tackling the fierce competition, devaluation of feelings, misogyny, and individualism encouraged under it will lead to a replication of those attitudes and systems later down the line. Capitalism and toxic masculinity are so intertwined in American society that eliminating one without the other would be, to put it mildly, difficult. We can put down the mask, though. Change and growth are possible, both on a personal and social level. Help is there if men need it. We just have to be willing to accept it. Hey everybody, if you liked this video, give it a like, maybe subscribe to the channel, share it with others on Twitter or Reddit or whatever. Drop a comment and let me know what you think of it. You can also follow me on Twitter at Radis Sordidis. I also run the Jack Saint parody account at BBQ Saint, so you can check that out if you really want to. And if you really like my work, consider sending a few dollars to my Patreon, which helps a lot at this point since I can't monetize any of my videos yet. I even have a tier where I'll write you a handwritten letter every month, which I think is pretty cool.